Hello everyone and welcome. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Zane Richer and these are the Capstone Commentaries. Well, today is Independence Day here in America. It's the day that we have an opportunity to stop and celebrate our freedom, but also hopefully take a little bit of time and reflect on it. So I hope that you're able to have a good time today to relax and to spend some time celebrating, because I think that the freedom that we have here in this country is well worth celebrating, and I hope you'll agree there. As for me, as I take a little bit of time and I stop and I really ponder and I really consider what this day means, it occurs to me that even though in many cases we here take the freedom that we have and the blessings that we have in this country for granted, there was a time in our nation's history when independence, what we celebrate on July 4th, was very far from determined. In the early spring of 1776, John Adams, who was a founding father of America and a future president of the United States, was working with the Continental Congresses, and he was in a difficult spot. They were working tirelessly. It was hard work. It was grueling work to keep the troops under General Washington encouraged and keep them supplied, and it seemed like an endless effort. And as they were working around the clock tirelessly, they kept getting word over and over again about battles that had been lost and defeats and various logistical emergencies, and it was just absolutely disheartening. And John writes this letter here. He writes it back home to Abigail, who is on the farm, and he laments the fact that he has to work around the clock and that he's not able to be there with her on the farm like he would like to be. And he recounts all of the devastating blows that the American cause suffered while he was trying to rectify it all. And he ends it with this extraordinary statement here at the bottom, which really stood out to me, and which I want to take a little bit of time with you here to discuss. And he gives this statement. He says, "Posterity, you will never know how much it cost the present generation to preserve your freedom. I hope you will make good use of it. If you do not, I shall repent in heaven that I ever took half the pains to procure it." Now that's a pretty extraordinary statement. I will repent from heaven that I ever took half the pains. And it stood out to me in one part because he's talking to us. He says, posterity, progeny, future generations of Americans. He's talking to you and me. He changes audiences from Abigail, who he's writing to, and he sends this personal note down the generation because he knew that we'd be reading this. It was an important enough event in history that he knew it would be studied later, and he gives us this message on the verge of independency. And he says, posterity, that's us. What is his message for us? How do we respond to it? These are the questions that are jumping out in my mind. And he says, you'll never know how much it cost the present generation. There's a cost, there's a sacrifice for freedom. But more than that, he says, once you have it, I hope you'll make good use of it. What does that mean? That stood out to me. What on earth does it mean to make good use of our freedom? We're told all the time what extraordinary freedoms we have. We're told about the sacrifice that was needed to procure it, the sacrifice in many cases of blood, that last full measure of devotion, and also of all the men and women that worked hard and tirelessly behind the scenes to make sure that we can celebrate today on July 4th. But what does it mean to make good use of the freedom once we have it? That was the question that stood out to me in my mind, and I wanted to take a little bit of time to go over a couple items, a couple thoughts that came to my mind as I'm thinking through this issue. How do you make good use of freedom? What does that mean? In other words, you could ask the question, what does freedom require of you and me, of the general public, of the population at large, of the body politic? What do we do to make good use of it? That's the question that we're going to try to answer today. So, number one, what does freedom require of us? Firstly, I would say that freedom requires that we be informed. You say to me, Zane, well, I know what's going on in the world. I know all the candidates. I know all the issues. I know when the next election is. That's great. That's good. But that's not enough. It's not enough just to know what's happening right now. If all we know is what's happening now, if all we know is politics in the modern age, then we know it in isolation. And the problem with knowing something in isolation is that we don't understand its context. And I guarantee you that you'll never understand anything unless you understand the context into which it's said. So, what happens when all we know is the modern political climate? That means we've lost the connection to the past. We don't understand its impact in the historical narrative, and we also, and here's the key, we won't be able to understand its ramifications for the future. So, it's not only necessary that we understand what's going on right now, it's necessary that we understand where do we come from? Who are we as a people? What is our shared history? What is our legacy? What is our heritage that we as Americans can hold on to? That's the question that we need to be about answering. Why? Because freedom requires it of us. We have to know who we are. And people have said to me, but, that's all well and good, but I was no good at history in school. I could never memorize all those dates. I could never understand what all those battles were about. It just gets all mixed up in my head. And I understand that. I really do. There's some things that I'm good at, and there's some things that I'm just not. Never ask me to solve a math problem for you. I'll get the wrong answer every time. On the other hand, at one point, while I was away at my university, another student came up to me and he said, "Zane, did you know that I can name for you every single battle of the American Revolution, and I can tell you when it was fought and where it was fought?" And I said, No, I didn't know that. And he said, "Well, don't you wish you could do that as well?" And I thought about it for a second, and I said, no, actually, I don't. I mean, I'm sure it's very helpful, but I think that the fact that you can do that is in many cases a result of the fact that we don't teach history right. And anyone that's been around me for any length of time will have heard me say that before. We don't teach history right at all. And it's because we put such a high emphasis on dates and on locations and on names. Those things are nice, but they're not the essence of what history is. We need to be about telling the stories that unite us as a people. Our common, our shared history, our legacy. What are those principles that are worth holding up in society, and then what are the stories in our past that we can identify, or the characters in these stories that we can find, that we can hold up, that are worth emulating? That's going to bring us together. And we don't do that anymore. And it's tragic, and because of it, we're losing our connection to our past. And you say to me, "Zane, what's so important about stories? What's so special about stories?" Well, I, for one, go back to when Christ was on earth, who, by the way, knew a thing or two about human beings, having created them, and I think, how did he relate to us? How did he teach his most important messages to us? He told stories. Stories that had points. Stories that upheld morals, that had values to communicate in them. And we have stories like that too. But how many of us know in the modern era the story, for instance, of Pocahontas and her relationship with John Rolfe and with the settlers in the Virginia colony? How she became a Christian and changed her name because of it. How many of us know the story of George Washington's prayer at Valley Forge and how it saved his life? We don't know these stories anymore. Or the stories that are not clear-cut, the stories that are black and white, that make us think. How many of us know the stories of Stonewall Jackson, who was a general for the Confederacy? However, his entire adult life, he on pain of death, in violation of the law, chose to bring slave children, black children, into his home to teach them how to read and to write. That was a capital offense. But he did it anyway because he knew it was right, because he needed to teach them how to read the Bible. Because he cared more about their souls than he did about illegitimate laws. And yet he fought for the Confederacy. What do we do with that? But we don't know these stories, so we can't think. What about the stories of someone like Harriet Tubman? You say to me, "Zane, we all know about Harriet Tubman. It's the Underground Railroad." Well, what about what happened to her after the war? In some ways, that's even more profound, even more significant to our history. How many of us know that she became an evangelist? She became a church planter. She realized that there are so many slaves, now emancipated slaves, throughout the South, that because they were either maimed or crippled or elderly, they were unable to work. But because they were unable to work, they were starving to death. And it was an epidemic in the South. And many people were reaching out to the government and they were saying, you need to do something about this. They're starving. But she said, no, that is not the government's role. That is our role. That is the role of Christian charity. And so she went around the South and she started churches and she started the first nursing homes in America. That's where they come from. And she preached the gospel to them. But we don't know these stories. But we can't neglect the stories of darkness, the stories of evil, because there are those in our country. We need to tell those stories. We need to tell the stories of Woodrow Wilson and his affiliation with the Ku Klux Klan and the eugenics movement. We need to tell the stories of Margaret Sanger and the introduction of Planned Parenthood and its nefarious purposes, because I guarantee that those same ideas, those same principles are still at play in that organization and in many people in this country. Because the struggle is not against the flesh and the blood, it is against the principalities, and those principalities are still there. And unless we have a way to connect ourselves with the stories that matter, to put ourselves in that place and to understand what it means to be courageous, or what it means to stand in the face of hopeless odds, we're never going to know how to move forward here. We're never going to understand what's happening now. So freedom requires that we be informed. All right, secondly, freedom requires that we be involved. Now, this is one that I've had to do a good bit of thinking over the last several years, because I had one idea which turned out to be insufficient for what this really means. I used to think that as long as I'm politically active, as long as I vote in the elections, as long as I have my voice heard in the machinery of government, then that was fine. Then that was enough. Then I was involved. That's good, but again, that's not enough. It is insufficient. When we say freedom requires that we be involved, that means more than just voting. That means we need to be involved in our communities. Communities are the cornerstone. Families and communities are the cornerstone of a thriving and a free people. We need to be involved in our communities. We need to be involved in our churches. We need to be involved in our civil organizations, our local politics. We need to be involved in our schools. We need to be involved in our neighborhoods. How many of us even know our neighbors anymore? And that's to our shame. We must. And I'll tell you why. Because it is the nature of any society in a fallen world that people will have problems. It happens to the best of us, whether that's financial problems, you're going to lose your house, or whether that's health problems, or whether that's the death of a loved one, or whatever it happens to be. We go through trials in this life. It marks the human existence. And there are two ways to deal with it when that happens. One way has said we need to give all the power and all of the agency to some mechanism outside of ourselves, so that when anything happens, it can reach in and set us right. That has historically been the approach of China, and the approach of the former Soviet Union, and the approach of Venezuela and Cuba and every other totalitarian country that has ever tried something of that nature. That's their approach, that they take out all of the choice involved so that they can fix all of the problems. Because the problems are going to be there anyway, and they have to be fixed. The question is how. They've said, we can do it. A free society, a free government, on the other hand, takes that power and vests it with people. It doesn't give it to an overbearing agency. It says, you have that authority. And that's an extraordinary blessing. It's a blessing that we get to gather around and celebrate today. And what it means for us is that we now have the ability, when we see someone that we know, in the context of relationship, in the context of accountability, when the government does something like this, there's no relationship. I can't have a relationship with the IRS. I can't have a relationship with Social Security, but I can have a relationship with my neighbor. And so when charity is done in that context, not only do I know them, can I be grateful and can I reciprocate, but I'm also accountable for it. And that's important in the whole scheme of charity. So, what that means for us is that when we see our neighbor that's suffering, some calamity, some tragedy has happened, we now have the choice. We can voluntarily step in and we can help them up. We can give them our hand. We can give them our money. We can help them. We can choose to do that. And it's voluntary. And because of that, it's meaningful. That's the blessing of a free society. But on the other side of that same coin, we have the choice to withdraw our hand, and we have the choice to turn our backs. We have the choice to walk around them just like the priest and just like the Levite in Christ's parable of the Good Samaritan. We can do that. We have the choice. This is a free society. But what we have to understand is as soon as we stop doing that, as soon as we give up that ability, that right, that responsibility, the problem doesn't go away. It's still there. Someone else is going to have to fix it. And generally, 9 out of 10 times, that's going to be the government. And so they'll take away more choices from people. And they'll take away more money from people to solve these problems because the problems have to be fixed. So what am I getting at? Freedom requires that we be involved. We be involved in our communities. We be involved with our neighbors. Why? Because those problems aren't going away. And unless we choose to do more, they're going to keep doing more. If we want to have those choices, we have to stop asking ourselves, what does freedom give us the ability to do? And start asking ourselves, what does freedom give us the responsibility to do? Part 3. Freedom requires that we be civil to one another. Now, this is not a very popular one in our day and age. It might even be the least popular one. Even a cursory view of the political landscape and even of the cultural landscape, forget politics, the cultural landscape of our modern age tells us that civility is the last thing on people. From the administration to the media, and each one, by the way, accuses each other. Well, let me tell you, you are both complicit in this. It's a downward spiral, and every single time that we engage in it, we participate in that downward spiral. Which is why on this program we will have a zero tolerance policy for anything that is uncivil. We will absolutely call out ideas. We will absolutely call out principalities because that is where the struggle is. But we're not going to attack people. We're not going to go after someone's character. We don't have that authority, and we're going to make sure that we are civil to one another. And our personal, and this is something that I've been trying to do in my own life. Forget this program. In my own life, to people that I know. And even people that I don't know, I've tried to maintain a civil posture. All that means is you engage with them as human beings. Those people on the other side that stand for exactly what you disagree with, whatever that is, those are people that God dearly loves. People that he loves enough to die for. And unless we see them that way, then we have departed from how God sees things. And that is to our own detriment every single time. Something that I hear often, though, people will say to me, well, Zane, that's a nice sentiment. That's all well and good, but don't you understand how desperate the times are? Don't you understand how late the hour is before us? Look at the oppression. Look at the persecution that we face. We don't have time to be civil anymore. We don't have the means. It is a luxury that we cannot afford. Well, I'd like to say very clearly right now that as far as I'm concerned, it is something that we can't afford not to do. And let me tell you a story. This is a document that was written in the 1960s, in the heart of the civil rights movement. It was written by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and it contains a list of 10 rules, 10 commandments, if you will, 10 codes of conduct for his movement. And he said, anyone that wants to march with me, anyone that wants to stand with me, anyone that wants to be involved or associated with me has to take this, they have to print it out, and they have to sign their name to it, and then give it to us so that we have it on record. And unless you're willing to pledge yourself on your life and your honor on this document, these rules here, then you are not going to be involved with my movement. And if you break any of them, we will immediately disavow you. This is his litmus test, whether you will be allowed into his office. And I'd like to draw your attention right now to rule number 6 here. He says, observe with both friend and foe the ordinary rules of courtesy. Observe with both friend and foe the ordinary rules of courtesy. What does that mean? This was a time in history, at the height of segregation, where all across the South, from Montgomery to Selma, where people that decided to exercise their basic human rights had fire hoses turned on them, had dogs set upon them, were beaten within an inch of their life on the burning pavement with clubs by police officers, and in some cases they did die. In the case of the man that wrote this, he was carted off to jail. And so the question that I have for everyone today is your persecution worse than that? Is the oppression that you face worse than what they faced? Because unless it is, I'm sorry, if they could abide by this, then you have no excuse why you can't. Unless you want to tell me that you've been personally dragged off to jail for exercising your rights, that you've been beaten within an inch of your life, that you've seen your family had dogs set upon them. Unless you can say that to me, then I think that you have no right to think that you can degrade other people, that you can insult other people's characters, that you can attack other people. I was listening to one of those talk shows, or one of those comedy shows, one of those late night comedy shows. It was the gentleman, I believe he was from, is he from South Africa? Do you know the guy I'm talking about? What's his name? Trevor Noah. And he had a bit where he was asked the question, or he was bringing up the question, should we use civility in discourse? And his response was, and I was astonished, I really was, his response was, well, look at Donald Trump. Where was civility when Donald Trump said this? Where was civility when Donald Trump did that? And that's a legitimate question. He should be acting civilly. But the fact that he's not does not give you the right to sink to that level. So again, unless you can tell me that the oppression that you face is worse than this, I'm going to say you have no right to behave uncivilly. Why? Because what happens when we do? When we turn against each other, that breaks apart the bonds of community, that divides one from another, neighbor from neighbor, brother from brother, that divides and dissevers and disjoins and sunders us. Our communities fall apart. And we've already said that unless a community is united, unless a community is willing to bear each other's burdens, to serve one another, regardless of what you believe, you cannot have freedom. Someone will take your choice away because you were not exercising it responsibly. And if we continue down this road, it leads to fragmentation. It leads us to a place where we no longer have those ties and those bonds of community, and then our choices get taken away. So, freedom requires that we be civil to one another. And lastly, freedom requires that we be moral. Now, I said before that maybe civility was the most unpopular thing to say in this modern climate. I think I was wrong. To say that we have to be moral, to say that we have to be restrained, to say that we have to actually govern our behavior by an external and transcendent code of conduct in this modern climate, people say that's political suicide. You can't say that. Well, I'm going to say it because it's true, because it's the only thing that has the power to save us from where we've gotten to. It's because of the rampant immorality, the lack of governance over our own lives, that we've come to where we are. But you certainly don't have to take my word for it. John Adams, founding father, a man who had a hand in writing our fundamental law, said that our Constitution was written for a moral and religious people. Moral and religious. Those two went hand in hand for him. He goes on to say it is wholly inadequate to the governance of any other. What's he saying there? He's saying that our country was made assuming a certain type of population. And anything other than that, well, our system wasn't designed to handle that. It's like saying we designed a car to run on gasoline. If you put water in it, it's going to blow up. That's what he's saying. Well, what have we done now? We've decided to cast out the idea of religion and morality from our public discourse. And shockingly enough, our society is blowing up. But we can continue on. Sam Adams, his brother, said this: "The sum of all is, if we would most truly enjoy the gift of heaven, let us become a virtuous people. Then we shall both deserve and enjoy it. While, on the other hand, if we are universally vicious, uncivil, and debauched, immoral, in our manners, though in the form of our Constitution carries the face of the most exalted freedom, we will in reality be the most abject of slaves." Unless we have this in place, it doesn't matter what kind of Constitution we have. It doesn't matter whether we have put in place every possible safeguard to our felicity as a people. We will be the most abject of slaves. George Washington goes on to echo this point. He says, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality, notice those two keep coming up, are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness, these firmest props of the duties of men and citizens. What do you say? You can't even say that you're a patriot. How dare you say that you're a patriot unless you are willing to acknowledge that these are the fundamental supports of political and human happiness, religion and morality. You say to me, well, Zane, I think that I can be moral without being religious. People say that all the time. And you know what? They're probably right. They probably can be. But here's the issue. Without religion, you have no reason to be moral. It's a sheer act of will in the face, in spite of what might get you ahead in life. And unless you have a reason for that, a transcendent reason, an objective reason, well, then you don't have any justification for your ideas. I'm glad that you live a moral life. I'm glad that you do the right thing as you see it. But the fact of the matter is, as a belief, as a philosophical system, I have no reason to respect it because you have no grounding for it. You've chosen to do so without any reasons that you can provide for it. And George Washington goes on to make this point when he says, let it be simply asked, where is the security for property, for reputation, for life, if the sense of religious obligation desert the oaths which are the instruments of investigation in the courts of justice? That's the he's asking why. Let us ask. Where is the security for any of these things if religious obligation deserts our civil oaths? We can say we're good people. We can even try to live moral lives. But unless there's something that gives us a reason to, where is the security for any of these things? Because on the same merit that we choose to live a moral life, which would be our own initiative, we can just as easily choose not to. And that's the point he's making. Washington concludes by saying a volume could not trace all of their connection with private and public felicity. This is the basis of a free system, and I can tell you why that is. The reason for that is because unless we are willing to govern ourselves, unless we're willing to restrain ourselves, Christian self-government, as our founders called it. And by the way, self-government is not what we're taught it means. We're taught it means that we vote for people to represent us in the government. That's not at all what it means. Self-government, Christian self-government, means the governance that we have over ourselves. And unless we're willing to exercise that, we can be guaranteed that it will be exercised for us. In other words, the question is not whether we will be governed in any one area or another. The question is, who will we be governed by? Is it going to be ourselves? Or are we going to give it up to someone else to choose for us? After all, governance in its most pure form is just choice. It's the exercising of choice, one or the other. Which do we choose? We do that every day. We make choices every day. That's a governance that we have to make that choice. The question is, how many choices are we going to be able to say, I am able to make that choice? I'm going to govern myself in that regard. I have a governance over my conscience. I have a governance over my beliefs. I get to choose these things. Or how many are we going to give away to other people to decide for us? There's an extraordinary quote by Robert Charles Winthrop, and he says, men, in a word, must necessarily be controlled, either by a power within them, or by a power without them, either by the word of God, or by the strong arm of man, either by the Bible, or by the bayonet. What's he saying? There's a direct proportionality between how much we are willing to govern ourselves and how much will be governed for us. If we choose to live according to the precepts of the Bible, we can be assured that all of those problems we can handle on our own that arise in life. We'll have the tools, we'll have the ability, we'll have the character which can overcome that. If we choose not to, well then when things happen, either in our neighborhoods, in our communities, or in our own lives, we'll be at the mercy of someone else. We'll have to give them the ability and the authority to leverage that control over us to govern for us in these instances. And that necessarily means that freedom is relinquished. And so freedom requires that we be moral and religious as a people. So those are my thoughts on this issue, on what it means to make good use of the freedom that we have, as John Adams said. Freedom requires that we be informed, that we know our heritage and our history. Freedom requires that we be involved. Freedom requires that we be civil to one another. And freedom requires that we be moral and religious. Those are the four that I got. If you're thinking about this and you have any ideas on any one of those, or you have any more that you'd like to add, I'd be more than welcome to hear from you. I welcome you to comment, to write those out, to send those, however you go about doing it. I'm sure Nathan will have all the right links and everything put up there. This is something that really is of interest to me. So if you have any thoughts, I'd be very interested to hear them and to try to think through those with you. But just to conclude, thank you so much for watching. I hope that this has been interesting in some regard for you, and I hope that you have a wonderful day celebrating this American holiday. I thank God for the freedom that we have, and I thank God for all of you watching. So.